Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and Business Line Leader for our medical, laboratory, and life safety and security businesses at Intertek. And today I could not be happier to be joined by Mr. Mike Murphy. Hi, Mike. How are you?
Hey, Clarissa. How are you?
I am great. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast. As I said before we started, a failure on my part that this is your first time on. So very excited to have you joining and talking with us today. So as I always like to do when I get started, would love for you to introduce yourself, your background, how long you've been at Intertek, and what your technical expertise areas are.
Well, I'm one of those lucky individuals who's never done anything other than EMC my entire adult life. Started out in the military for 6 years, and I've actually done EMC for about 42 years, 38 for Intertek.
Amazing. And you sit in our Boxborough facility. So one of our largest teams, one of our biggest sites where we do EMC testing. So you've kind of seen it all over your career and being here with us at Intertek. So today we're going to talk about a topic, something new that's been going around. There's been a lot of discussion over the IEC 60601-4-2 and the change from the TS to the TR, right? The change in between. So maybe you can just give an overview for everyone of this TS 60601-4-2 and how that differs from the old TR 60601-4-2.
Okay. Let me start with just the two of them are similar in that there's not many differences between them. It's basically the progression of a document, the way that the document progresses as it becomes more and more official. The TR as a technical report starts out as a lot of great ideas as to how to do something in particular. And as it becomes more specific, it gets transferred over to a TS or a technical specification. And it's just basically the life of a technical document. This is still a guidance document. So whether it was TR version or now the TS, they're both guidance documents for how to approach something. In this case, it's performance of those non-medical functions of a medical electrical system or equipment.
Okay, that makes sense. So we're moving from the old TR version now to a TS, just meaning that going from a report to a specification because the requirements are becoming more clear because it's the evolution of the document itself. It's not really that the requirements themselves are changing. It's not really that there's a lot of big differences or that there's any sort of significant changes. Technically, it's more so just the change in verbiage or how a document is described going from a report to a specification.
Correct. And there are a couple of differences, but they're very minor. One was it's better aligned with the 4th edition and the 4.1 edition of the 601-1-2 standard. And it was also cleaned up a little bit as far as references are concerned. The major technical change, if we want to call it that, is that under the conducted RF immunity testing, the cable exemption changed from 3 meters long to 1 meter. So now if you have a cable that's less than 1 meter long, you don't have to do conducted RF immunity testing to it. But the one thing to remind everybody of is the United States FDA doesn't care. they don't care how long the cable is. They want you to test it anyways for conducted RF immunity. So that exemption is not available in the United States.
Yeah, so you would still be needing to look at that and do that. So as you mentioned, the guidance mostly is focused on immunity, right? EMC immunity, but it doesn't really address emissions. So how do I interpret that as a manufacturer, right? Okay, I'm following these immunity requirements, but what about emissions? Like, what am I supposed to do?
So emissions doesn't change. Emissions is more about interfering with another product that's co-located in your intended use environment. And that concern doesn't change. So whether it's interfering with licensed communications, or other medical equipment to make sure it continues to perform correctly when it's close to your equipment, that hasn't really changed. So your emissions evaluation isn't going to shift. What does happen, though, is this is an immunity document that starts to pull back in some of those requirements that have disappeared out of the later versions of 601-1-2. So in the 2nd edition of the standard, we were focused on you designed a product to do something. And when it stops doing that, that's not acceptable. That's the 2nd edition of 601-1-2. In the 4th edition and 4.1, what ended up happening was a lot of that intended use went away. And people started to focus on essential performance based on risk management and required performance in the multiple particular standards that were being generated.
Yeah. So now this goes back to intended use, right? So it's a big part of the document, right? Is the concept of what your intended use is. And I mean, how do you see that, right? Really differing from essential performance, or how you're applying safety, right? Or how you're applying, basic safety and essential performance versus intended use, or how you're applying testing. Are you looking at it separately, or are you looking at it as one big thing? Okay, this is your intended use, and then this is your basic safety and essential performance. And then we put a test plan together or put requirements together based on both of those things.
In many cases, the best approach is to deal with things that you have control of. So first we start by getting rid of the things we don't have control of, like required performance. If it's in a particular standard and I am an HF surgical generator, there are certain requirements I have to meet in order to meet that particular standard. I don't get to vote on that, right, as a manufacturer. But now when we deal with my risk management file and I start to deal with essential performance, I'm allowed to weigh the risk of if a particular function stops working properly, how risky is that to the health of the patient, safety of the patient? So those come by essential performances. So I've got required performance I don't get to vote on, essential performance, which I have some control over, with risk management. And then I have this other thing, which is intended use. So I've told my end user the product will do like 3 or 4 other things. And in many cases over the past, 10 years or so, those things were never evaluated during a test. So during an EMC evaluation, they were never checked because they weren't essential and they weren't required. So this is a way of bringing it back to, almost dialing it back to the second edition of the 601 standard. Yeah. So whatever you designed your product to do, let's make sure that you checked that during your immunity testing.
Great. This approach very much makes sense. Like if you are the manufacturer saying, okay, this is the intended use, right? You want to make sure that you're testing for that as you're going through the process. So are there specific examples or things that you could think of that would be considered like an intended use function, but then wouldn't really fall under what we would consider an essential performance function?
Sure. So let's look at something simple like a medical imaging system. So I have this medical imaging system. It could be a CT scanner. And it has certain essential performances that I have to monitor during testing. It might be the intensity of the X-ray. It might be the length of time that the person is exposed to that X-ray. Those are going to be things that come up in risk management file that say this is essential performance. There's also some required performance in the particular standards that apply to a piece of medical imaging equipment. But then there's this little thing that says that the doctor can go back to his office and he can look at the images that have been sent to the hospital network. Now, that's not going to endanger the patient if for some reason the doctor can't pull that image, because he can have it sent again to the hospital network. But at the same time, the doctor does kind of depend on that so he can continue to think about the person's treatment. So I've told the end user that they can do this, right? They can push all these images to the hospital network and they'll be available to him afterwards. Well, what if when I do my immunity testing, I never evaluate that communication? I don't know what's going to happen once they finally put it into the hospital. I don't know if that's going to work. So that's where that gets pulled back in, where it's not essential, it's not required, but it is something that the doctor depends on, and it helps with the treatment of the patient. It helps with the diagnosis of the patient.
Yeah, that's such a great example. The other thing that comes up a lot, and we've been talking about it more and more now that we're seeing different types of environments and products being used outside of just like a traditional clinical environment, things that are being used in like nursing homes or care facilities, right? And we see, the FDA having one view on that and some, kind of disconnect between how like a regulator might view something versus language in a document. So are there things or tips that you can give or help provide some clarity when we look at things like some of these environments and how the FDA might view it versus how the document might walk someone through it?
Sure. So when we look at, let's talk about nursing homes in the United States. One of the key things we have to remember is in the United States, a nursing home is a professional healthcare facility. Mm-hmm. So even in the 601-1-2 standard, you're testing to lower test levels because it's a more controlled environment, right? Professional healthcare.
Yeah.
However, in most of the rest of the world, it's viewed as home healthcare because in many cases, these nursing homes are in homes, right? So they have carpets on the floor. They have all this other stuff where the immunity events, those actual test levels or those levels of those events are going to be higher. So they evaluate it as if it were for home use, and they test the extra frequencies. They test the higher test levels for that for the rest of the world. We have to be real careful in this guidance document where we remember that these things that are not essential, these things that are not required, are going to have to live in the same environment as the rest of that medical system. So if the real environment has higher ESD levels in it, in order for it to actually work properly once it's out in the field, it's going to have to be immune to those higher levels. So we just have to be real careful when we look at reduced levels that are in the guidance document, as opposed to testing the levels that are already in, the 601-1-2 standard.
Well, yeah, now that you bring up 60601-1-2, which of course most people are familiar with, is the test standard that we use for EMC. How do these two relate to each other, right? Am I following 60601-1-2? Am I following, how are they interrelated? Are they related? How should I view this as, knowing that this is our test standard versus?
Yep. You're always going to be testing 601-1-2 because it's a medical device. But what this guidance document reminds us of is not to forget about those intended use performance factors, where, like I said, they kind of got pushed aside after the second edition of the standard. Now, that was back in 2001. So back in 2001, we had this idea of whatever we designed the product to do, it should keep doing that in an EMC noisy environment. And we've kind of gotten away from that. So now it brings us back to that thought process or that way of thinking, where let's not leave it out. Let's make sure we take care of essential performance, required performance, and don't miss those things that are really beneficial to the medical team and to the patient. So this communication that maybe not be essential, it's not required, but it would be really nice if it worked all the time in the environment that it's intended to be used in. So it's a complementary document where if we use that to drive our test plan, if we use that to drive the way that we set up for our EMC testing, we won't miss any of the intended use of the product because we'll evaluate it properly. And in most cases, during our 601-1-2 testing.
Yeah, and then as a manufacturer, am I responding to anything in the technical specification? Am I putting information together? Or am I really just following it as a guide for then how I am actually implementing my testing and my test plan?
You're going to look at it in your risk management file as, we're going to apply the guidance of this to any of those functions of the product that we've decided is not related to essential performance, not related to required performance, but they are things that are really beneficial to the medical team and the patient. So when you write up your test plan, it's going to be included because it's in your risk management file. So you start with that it does need to be included in there. And you need to describe how it's going to be monitored. You need to describe what those performance criteria are in order to know that it's operating properly. And so it starts there. It ends up in your test plan. And that means it also ends up in our resulting test report when we finish our evaluation, because you're going to be covering, or at least pointing to, required performance, right? Essential performance and intended use of the product. And you're going to call out the 60601-4-2. You're going to use that reference specifically so the FDA is able to find it in your documents.
That makes sense. So I start with the technical specification in my risk management. I go through, we have our test plan, we're ready to go, we're executing on our testing, we're ready to get our testing done. Of course, we're referring to the 4-2 for when we make our submission. But now when we're actually running the testing and getting into it, we're talking about this idea of intended use versus essential performance. Do you test for those same things at the same time? Do you test one after the other? Like, how do you actually then put it into practice if you're trying to execute on the testing?
With some good planning and depending on how the system is designed, we have the same problem with essential performance and required performance, where sometimes the way that the product is designed, a manufacturer has to split it into different configuration or different modes of operation so that all of the performance can be monitored properly. All this does is add another layer to that, where if you can't monitor that communication at the same time, because it's only sent by request, you have to think about that when you're setting up for testing. So it's really important during the project planning, when you're working on developing the product, that you start thinking about clearly identifying all of your performance criteria: essential, required, and intended use. And if you do that, you can start working on either custom firmware or specific configurations so that you can monitor as many of those criteria as possible at the same time. If you don't think about that ahead of time, you're left with, you're in the lab and you've missed one, so you've got to add another configuration or another mode of operation. And unfortunately, if you wait until the last part of your product development, that's what ends up happening is we've got like 5 different configurations that need to be tested because none of your performance can be monitored at the same time. Where if you talk to us about it way ahead of time, we're at least able to get you to think through it and say, well, can I combine any of those so I can reduce those number of configurations?
So obviously a lot of pros to thinking about it early, a lot of pros to planning it early and having that test plan ready to go. Are there any cons to testing things at the same time? Any issues with the results that you're getting? Any reason why you would decide, oh, we want to test these configurations or test these things separately?
Not unless you start to have issues with certain parts of the test. So there are times where certain things can be done at the same time and other ones can't. When we look at like an assay piece of equipment where it moves samples around and then it measures things, a lot of times it'll have to be done in 2 configurations where you'll have samples being moved and that's one configuration, one set of firmware that drives that. You'll do that test and then you'll run all the same tests all over again with it just with a single sample doing an analysis. And the reason you do that is if you let it run the way it normally runs, it would take a minute for it to actually take a sample, move it, analyze it, and give you results. So rather than a 3-second dwell time on some of your tests, you'd end up having to wait for a minute, and it would turn into hours and hours and days in the test lab just because you didn't think about splitting that into 2 different efforts or 2 different configurations.
Yeah, obviously you've been doing this for such a long time, as you mentioned too, right? And there's never a static test plan, right? You never come in and just follow it directly, right? There's always going to be things that can change as you get into testing, as you're seeing how things are performing, right? As you say, you may decide to change midway through. So I think that's something that, is quite interesting about EMC and how the testing works, right? It's always going to keep you on your toes. And you're always going to be, maybe looking at things differently or changing things around as you go.
Yeah, it's a very analytical and engineering process where when something doesn't quite seem to be working properly, whether it's, the fact that you're trying to get through a test, you have to really step back and think about, is there a better way to do this? Is there a different way to do this where I can save some time and still do it correctly? Obviously, that's always the bottom line is you have to do things correctly or else there's no point in doing it. But at the same time, there's sometimes a better way to move it through the process and get the testing done. That's just one of those things that there's always room to wiggle a little bit and say, well, we've got to do this a little bit different. Sometimes it's better to start over and go, wait a second, that's not really right. Let's update the firmware and we'll do it, a little bit. It's going to save us weeks in the lab. That's one thing that we're actually really good at is thinking on our feet and going, okay, that's not working. Let's do something else. And if you've been an engineer for a hot minute, you understand that a lot of it has to do with adapting to what happens and actually picking a good path forward. There is no cookbook to doing EMC. It's always reacting to what you see.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about ESD, right? So ESD testing and the way that it's called out in 60601 versus the way that it's called out in the technical specification, right? Is it actually different? Is it just a different wording to say the same thing? Like, should people be concerned or be looking at the differences of how it's described in the two different documents?
It's actually, so it parallels a couple of other standards in that if you're going to have a connector that is going to intentionally be left open and uncabled, somebody can touch that. You can get an ESD event to like jump to those pins because you're not covering it, you're not hiding it, and there's not always a cable on it in the way that the product's always used. So you need to evaluate it. You need to be able to test it for ESD, the shell of the cable, and in the case of the 4-2 guidance, even the pins of the cable. Now, the one advantage that you have in the 4-2 document, in this guidance document, is that it harkens back to the 3rd edition of the standard and allows you to do an ESD connector exemption by putting a specific label next to the connector that says, hey, don't touch this. It's basically a hand with a lightning bolt going through it. It's like, no, this is ESD sensitive, don't mess with it. So they have allowed some stuff in there in this guidance document and said, if you have to leave a connector open, or if you normally do, then at least put that little symbol over it that says, hey, don't test this for ESD, don't touch it. You shouldn't be playing with it. And in the fourth edition of the standard, that went away. So you can't use that label. But now if this particular connector is related to something that's not essential performance, not required performance, then you can put a symbol next to it and say, don't touch it. And it parallels a couple other standards out there for like multimedia and some other things.
Yeah, that's really great information. So the other thing too, I just want to touch on before we end is just the idea of the regulators and FDA. And, we've seen the FDA really focus a lot more on EMC over the last few years, right? Really pushing a lot harder in terms of what their expectations are for EMC testing, what they want to see, how you're indicating it to them. And I know you mentioned that a little bit, right? Wanting to call out the 4-2 in your test plan. So it's very clear to the FDA when you're making your submission, their requirement of the cable length versus what's being called out in the specification. So are there things that we're seeing or have seen that manufacturers are hearing back from the FDA, or things that we can anticipate, as they're, of course, with the end goal many times being to take all of this information and put it into a submission?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is as technology changes, right? So as we go from an analog cell phone to a digital cell phone to multiple channels to 4G, 5G, all these different, networks that now are available, the FDA has concerns about that as far as, is it going to affect the medical products that are being put on the market? So they're always going to have that conversation. And I like to call it a conversation because it's a kinder way of dealing with things when you get a letter back from the FDA. It's a conversation. They're going to ask you questions about, have you thought about RFID readers? Have you thought about, and if you didn't test for RFID readers, was there a good reason? So is your product always off by itself? It's in a vault. Nobody can be in the vault unless I give them permission. So what equipment's going into that vault. Okay, maybe you're not worried about an RFID reader. But if it can just go into a general hospital space, there's going to be a badge reader on the wall. There's going to be the little detector that goes off if somebody steals a baby. Those are all RFID readers. They're all sensors. And so you can't really say your equipment's not going to be near that because it might be in the room adjacent to that, right? So those are the things that the FDA asks questions when you look at all the technologies that are out there. And the way that manufacturers really do have to think about it is, I have to know exactly what my intended use environment or environments are, and I have to identify the threats to the proper operation of my product in those environments. So if I know what technologies are being used there, I know which ones of these tests apply to me and which ones that I can justify away and say, well, I don't really have to worry about that because none of that's ever in my environment. So that's a good place to start when you're developing a product, is to say, well, I have to understand the threats to my product operating properly. And the better you understand that, then the better you can design the product to make sure that you'll continue to operate properly in your intended use environment.
Yeah, that's such good advice. And then too, like you said, to just be prepared, obviously, as we're seeing the FDA really taking such an interest in EMC and all of these different environments, especially now that we know, again, that medical devices are being used now in, nearly every possible and potential environment, right? So we have to be thinking about that from early on. Well, this was such a great topic, really interesting to talk about. Is there anything that we missed that you want to tell anybody about the 4-2 or anything they should be thinking of? Of course, they can always come to us and ask any questions that they have. Get started early, as you said, a couple of different times, right? It's much earlier to start, or better to start at the beginning and get your test plan ready and understand exactly what those risks might be.
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing, the biggest takeaway from this is, Intertek is in a position with a lot of senior engineers that have done this type of testing throughout the development of technology. So we started with no cell phones. we started with 8 baud dial-up modems. There was no internet. So we started with those technologies all the way to what we have today. And there are a lot of people on my team. There are a lot of people on my team globally that can help with the questions that you have, or even the questions that the FDA sends back to you and says, hey, have you thought about this? There's nothing wrong with pulling us to the table and saying, have you even seen this before? Because we can always help. And whether it's our senior engineers that are within our test labs, or whether it's our consulting group, Intertek can step in at almost every phase of a product development and help.
So true. And we're happy to do it always. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. If anyone has questions, of course, you can always reach out to me directly and I'll be happy to connect you with Mike or any of our subject matter experts. Thanks so much for joining.